Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Union, and in this one we start out in the Kursk region where the Russians continue their offensive operations. Over the past 24 hours, the Russians have managed to capture Pokrovsk here to the southwest of Lyubimovka. They've also managed to capture several fields in between that of Lyubimovka and Snagost, reaching the outskirts of it. According to the latest reports, the Russians have managed to enter several times, but they are failing to get a foothold so far due to Ukrainian resistance. The defensive line here by the Ukrainians along Lyubimovka to Lenidovo here to the east is a very important one. Breaking through that will allow the Russians to hit the core of the Ukrainian supplies here in the Kursk region and flank Suchev from the rear. This is why the Ukrainians are putting heavy resistance along this defensive line. At the same time, the Russians are also flanking in the northern direction to cut off the road for the Ukrainian soldiers here east of Koronevo. The objective of the Russians is to close this road and cut off the Ukrainian soldier presence within it, to hit the Ukrainians while they are withdrawing if they attempt to withdraw or simply encircle them. In that way, the Russians will be able to secure this northern flank as well and start a push towards the eastern flank of this defensive line. If the Ukrainians relocate their forces towards Lyubimovka, they will be flanked from the rear. If they keep their forces spread thin, then the Russians will be able to achieve a foothold within Lyubimovka and then take advantage of that to capture the town. So we see that the Russians are increasing the pressure with their Kursk counteroffensive, and so far success is reported with this advance taking place on a daily basis. At the same time, we see reports of the Ukrainians attacking the village of Veseloe here along the border area, where the Ukrainians are looking to flank the Russian offensive by pushing in the direction of Kloshkovo. However, the Russians have prepared defensive positions along the border area and are so far preventing the Ukrainians from reaching into Russian territory and attacking the flank of the Russian offensive. If the Russian offensive continues like this and succeeds, they'll be able to hit the rear of Ukraine's supply lines, cut off the supplies to the western flank of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, and allow them to hit the rear of the supply lines along the border area, or potentially push into Ukrainian territory, which would cancel the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. In the meantime, the Ukrainians are not bothered too much because they started to push the Russians out of the village of Cherkaskoe Poreshno. So we see that the Ukrainians continue offensive operations in eastern Kursk, while the Russians are counterattacking on the western flank. And according to Zelensky, everything is going according to plan. So maybe I shouldn't spoil any of the future changes. I'll just keep it as is, keep the dream going. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have expanded northwest of Kalinina along the western bank of the canal, capturing some of these fortified positions along the canal and securing the crossing from the northern flank. With the connection between the northern and southern flank, the Russians have a wider crossing across the canal in the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, which could lead to further advances here in the forest area and in the northern and central microdistricts east of Chasiv Yar. In the New York section of the front line, as well as Toretsk, there are some advances. The Russians have managed to advance south of the gas station here in the central parts of Toretsk. They are moving into the residential area to gain full control of the area here in this section of Toretsk. The goal here is to cut off the supplies to the hill, to capture the hill, and then move through the main road to connect through to the southern parts here, where the Russians also have a foothold. There's also likely heavy fighting within the forest area, but it is unclear how much either side controls of it, because if the Russians are launching offensive operations there, it is difficult to geolocate any of the positional fighting, and it is difficult to find any actual fighting, because the frontline soldiers usually do not update that much. It is usually FPV drones and other long-range units that give us geolocated information, and this typically only happens once a battle is over, not to compromise the integrity of the fighting. In the New York section of the front line, the Russians have secured the entirety of the industrial zone. They have fully captured it. If there were any Ukrainian soldiers left, there are none now, and they have secured their foothold in southern Nelipivka. They've also secured the road between Selishne and Nelipivka. This means that the Russians will now continue offensive operations here in the direction of Nelipivka. Following the arrival of the 12th Azov Brigade, the Ukrainians have been able to recapture some territory and push the Russians back, but now the Russians are turning the tables on the Azov Brigade. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, there are several changes. The first one is the Russians managed to advance in the southern flank, gaining a foothold within Lysivka and capturing the forest areas west of Novorodivka. They are also fighting towards Chasiv Yar, however this remains a grey zone, and the perfect balance arrives with the Ukrainians recapturing Mykolaiivka, pushing the Russians out of the northern bank of the river line, and the Krasny Yar remains in a grey zone, while the Russians remain controlling of Kruchi Yar in the eastern flank. So see, the Ukrainians are attempting to counterattack not just in the Selidovo direction, but also in the Pokrovsk direction. To the south of Krasnovarivka, significant developments took place as the Russians managed to break through several kilometers of Ukrainian positions to reach Hostre and gain control over Hostre in the northern flank of Maximilyanivka. If we take a look at the topographic map, we can see that the area the Russians have captured is all located on the high ground north of Maximilyanivka, while Maximilyanivka itself is located on the low ground. This means that the capture of this small village and the entire fields behind it, between Krasnovarivka and it, means that the Russians are now in full control over the high ground to the north of Maximilyanivka, and with their foothold within the town itself, it will give a significant advantage to the Russians in the fighting over the remaining parts of it, and the Russians will now be able to cut the connection between Kurakhove and the northern flank here west of Krasnovarivka completely. As we see, the roads here connected are also located on the low ground, and this means that the Russians will likely take advantage of this to hit the supply roads and the connection between the northern and southern parts, which will force the Ukrainians withdrawing from the pocket north of Krasnovarivka to withdraw towards Hrynik rather than Kurakhove, and there will be no connection towards Kurakhove besides going all the way around. This will significantly limit the connection between Kurakhove and Pokrovsk in the north, and will also put a strain on the Ukrainian capacity to withdraw their units, as they only have one exit now. This also means that the Russians will focus on pushing in the direction of Hrynik to gain control over that as well, to connect the two sides from the south and from the north. The Ukrainians had been adamant about withdrawing from this pocket. This has led the Russians to continue the operations to attempt to cut off all supply roads to these units and to cut off any withdrawal from the future. We see that there is one road that is connected between this pocket down to Kurakhove, and this goes through this reservoir here to the western parts of Krasnovarivka, but is cut off with the Vovcha river line. If the Russians gain control over this intersection right here, there will be no connection between this area and Kurakhove. They would have to go through the rear, over this bridge, over the Vovcha river, or through the entire rear, going all the way around. The Russians here would be looking to gain control over this intersection here in the south, which they are very close to. They'll gain control over the fields in that process and attack Oleksandropol. This will allow the Russians to have control over the southern flank and southern bank of this river line, and at the same time they will likely push in the northern direction to connect between Shelane Pershe and Krasnovarivka through this road to gain control over the next portion of this pocket, and then push down south along the Vovcha river line, which would end this pocket completely. At the same time, the main push will come in the direction of Hrynik, where they will look to gain control over this town. The Russians are generally fighting heavily across the entire section of the front line, and the Ukrainians are trying to reverse the situation and slow down the Russian advance and offensive by launching their own counterattacks with the reserves that arrived, which allowed the Russians to launch their counteroffensive in the Kursk direction. Finally, in the south, here by Pereshistivka, the Russians have launched new operations towards Lozaniva, which has allowed them to capture some of the fields between the two towns, and now the Russians are very close to Lozaniva with the recent advances, capturing a fortified position and reaching the outskirts of it. So the Russians are now in a position where they have direct eyesight of the village, and it is likely that they will launch an operation to take control of it, which will secure the eastern flank of Velika Novosilka in favor of the Russians, and the Russians may start an operation here in the Remevsky Ledge direction towards the town of Velika Novosilka being the target. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.